Tonight, I'm very happy to say we do have a writer, a memoirist by the name of Stephanie Cassatly. And she has written a wonderful book, Notice of Release, A Daughter's Journey to Forgive Her Mother's Killer. This is a debut memoir which appeared just this year.
Yes, correct.
In the past few years, she says, she's been publicly telling her story and speaking generally on the topic of forgiveness. I have found, she says, there is a great deal of interest and need for this conversation as virtually everyone has something or someone they struggle to forgive. I certainly do, and I bet most of our viewers do as well. Additionally, she is a contributor to the international organization called the Forgiveness Project, founded by Desmond Tutu. I'm going to read a little bit more bio from the back of her book on her education. She earned her undergraduate degree in business from Emory University and an MFA in writing from Vermont College of Fine Arts. Her work has been published in literary journals and anthologies, and many of those works have won awards and notable mentions. She speaks on the topic of forgiveness, is a contributor, as I mentioned, to the Forgiveness Project and teaches writing at Palm Beach Atlantic. She resides in Florida, but often visits Cape Ann. Stephanie, welcome to the Writer's Block.
Thank you, John.
Thank you for coming down.
It's a pleasure.
This is a wonderful book. I want to hold it up so that our director, Jim Capillo, can get a shot of that. Notice of Release. The release is clearly your release and the prisoner's release, kind of release. And I don't want to jump into it myself because I might reveal some spoilers, might contain some spoilers. Can you describe the book?
Sure. The plot, you mean?
Yes.
Okay. The plot is essentially about the murder of my mother in 1980 when I was a freshman in college. She was living in New Orleans. I had just gone to school at Emory in Atlanta and received a visit from my aunt that in the middle of my first semester that she came to collect me for my mother's funeral, and it was a big shock, a complete fork in the road for my life, nothing I could have ever imagined. And essentially what happened was she was working in a store, and right before closing one night, the store was held up. Two men came in and held her at gunpoint. She emptied the cash register, gave them everything they wanted, and on the way out the door, they pushed her and shot her and killed her, and she died instantly. So the book is about that murder, but it is also about all the years preceding that murder and following that murder. The preceding years sort of take the reader to why she was in that position, what brought her to New Orleans, what had transpired in her life and our life as my family prior to the murder. And then after the murder, the challenge that I faced in terms of reconciling this new life that I was forced to live. I often say that my mother's death was like being dropped off a train blindfolded with no ticket to go home. Just complete disorientation. Metaphor. Yeah, just where to go from here. And so it's the story of those years, and then the incredible serendipitous event that occurred in my 40s, where I came to the notion that maybe I should find her killer and learn about him, and which ultimately led me to forgive him. And in the process of doing that, I learned a great deal about not only myself, but about him, and about the process of forgiveness, which is more universal than I ever realized. There is a process, and people frequently say, well, how do you forgive? And there's, through a lot of research and study during this book and then beyond this book, I realized there is a process. And it's available to anyone and everyone if they so choose it.
As someone who's gone through this process after a personal tragedy, is it believable to you that parishioners, for instance, at the church where Roof killed 8, 9 people bloodthirstily and cold blood, as they say, that they say within a week or a month that they have forgiven him? Is that possible?
Well, it doesn't feel possible to me. I'm not judging what was in their hearts or whatever, but it took me 20 years to even sort of consider the possibility. And also, I think time really is important. I mean, that's a big piece of the process, giving it time. But I also think that it's important to try to define what forgiveness is and is not. I think that the traditional sort of concept of forgiveness where, you say sorry and I say, okay, I forgive you and you're off the hook is to me is not relevant in situations like this or in what happened in Charleston. I think that forgiveness in these kinds of situations is not about the offender. I think it's about the victim and the victim trying to find a way to live more peacefully and not to hold that vengeance and hatred so deeply that it's like drinking poison.
It's self-destructive.
Self-destructive, yeah.
So forgiveness, if you could define it, and you're going to put your definition on the internet.
Right there.
Look up, how would you define forgiveness?
I would define it as Desmond Tutu says it, and he says that forgiveness is nothing more than refusing to pay back your offender in the same coin. Because you hurt me and took something horrible from me does not mean that I have to act in the same way towards you.
So it's a very realistic, worldly definition. It doesn't ask you to be smarmy and affectionate or soft. It's just that you're not going to, revenge is...
I am not going to give you that power over me anymore. I'm not going to give you that power. I'm going to take that away from you. It's almost a very selfish act in some respects. Selfish, and it has nothing to do with justice either. I mean, that's one of the things that I struggled with was so much was that I did not want to forgive him if it meant that he could get out of prison earlier. I had no interest in lessening his sentence, which didn't happen anyway because he died in prison. But
he had cancer.
Yeah.
Something that really jumped out at me, to me, in the book is the structure. We learn a lot about your family moving around Mexico, and you have half brothers and sisters, and then back to Louisiana on the river. And through that process, I came to really care about your family before we get to the murder. And these sequences are broken up by a visit to
Angola,
where the murderer was
sentenced
in prison.
Yeah, in Angola, I'm not sure if you've ever seen or read anything about Angola. There a lot of movies have been made there.
The Green Mile,
The
you
Green
mentioned.
Mile,
And,
Dead Man Walking. There's an incredible documentary called The Farm, which
I hadn't seen that.
Very interesting. They interview prisoners, that are on death row, because they have the electric chair there, or they had the electric chair. Now they have. But they have executions at Angola, and
So you flew to New Orleans from your home in Florida,
yes,
and then drove up to Angola,
yes,
on one day.
In one day,
just one long visit.
One day, full day of a visit, which takes place throughout the book. So there's sort of two storylines. The one storyline is that one day visit to Angola, which I don't want to say too much about it, but it's a visit that takes place after I have forgiven him. It doesn't take place. I don't meet him to forgive him in the prison, but the prison sheds a tremendous amount of light on his life, on the process, on what happened. It's a very sort of a lot of closure in that visit, but there's still sort of a twist at the end of that prison visit. But that one day is there are 9 chapters that are interspersed throughout the book that are sort of like a thread, and then my family story is the backstory told in the past tense that kind of weaves in and out of that one prison. But there's a lot of sort of, hopefully, thematic connections between what's going on at the prison and
I think
and the
that
family.
structure worked very, very well.
Thank you.
And it created suspense, which I think is almost impossible to do in a book where you know what's happened and you know why it's happened. And so there's not going to be a who did it at the end or some bombshell, although there is a bombshell. But I think you did a masterful job of creating suspense and mystery in a book that is quite upfront about what it's about.
Thank
It
you.
works.
Yeah. Well, it's funny that you're talking about the bombshell or the twist at the end. And I'm not going to say too much about it, but the interesting thing about the ending was that I had written the book and completed it with a different ending. And then there was an editor that looked at the book who asked me, following the whole, A Million Little Pieces debacle with Oprah, who crucified Fry for fictionalizing some of his book. So this editor said to me, "Is everything in this book true?" And I had taken some creative license in the last chapter of the book and knew that I had, done that, and I felt pretty uncomfortable with it. And so I said no. I did not have the proper ending that I expected to have from my prison visit. So I took some creative liberties and created sort of an imagined ending. And she said, no. You have to get to the bottom of what really happened. So that delayed the actual conclusion of the book, and I had to go back and do more research and make phone calls and write letters and think things through to get the ending.
I mentioned we're going to hold this up a couple of times. I'm going to hold it up again. This really is a fine book, and I'm not going to tell you the ending, and Stephanie's not going to tell you the ending, but I recommend you get this about forgiveness. But it's a good story in itself and done very, very well. Even though you know from this show and you know from the jacket what it's about, it still really ticks along.
Thank you. Yeah. It's funny. When I wrote this, I did not. My original impetus to write this book was not to write a book. It was to sort of document what had happened for my children, for my family, and then it sort of morphed from there. But it really took on a life of its own and continues. It's funny, the book is in print, but I feel like now, with speaking engagements and everything that come with it, I feel like the book has its own legs.
And are you quite busy delivering delivering talks?
I am. It's been really, book clubs are a really big, because there's so much to talk about, that book clubs seem to have glommed onto this. I do about 2 book clubs a week at this point. Yeah.
Is it kind of exhausting?
It is exhausting. I'm rethinking that a little bit. I don't know if that's my best. I enjoy this because it has sort of a wider audience and also because the conversation's a little different, but it's kind of repetitive with book clubs.
One of our sons is a musician, and he's always on the road.
Yeah.
He's a lot younger, of course.
Yeah.
I don't know how he can do it even at his age.
Yeah, he should think about, what he's going to do a few years from now.
Yeah. I said before the show I wanted to spend some time talking about the the epilogue material, which is about, should I call it the art of forgiveness?
Yeah, or the coda,
The coda, the directions on how to forgive, which you talk about in your lectures, and which you spell out here in the end of the book. The coda. I'm getting to the numbered.
Yeah, and I just want to classify too, because I call it like my reflections as opposed to like instructions for anybody else, because I'm very careful, and I don't want anyone to think that this is my story and just my process, and if people can find value in it and you take a piece of it or all of it, that's great, but I don't actually pretend to say that this is the way to do it or the right way to do it.
Code is a good word, not dogma.
I don't want it to be dogma, and it's not meant to be. Thank you for clarifying that. Good difference.
I wonder if I could read down
Sure.
this list, and you could tell me what they mean. The first one, these are the process of forgiveness.
Okay.
The first one you've already touched on. The first is defining forgiveness.
Right.
And would you repeat that according to Tutu's?
Sure. And sometimes you have to back into what forgiveness is not. And Tutu says this too. He says it's not condoning the act. It's not drawing a veil over the hurt. It's not seeking any lesser vengeance. It's not minimizing, the gravity of the act. It's none of those things. And what Desmond Tutu says is that he says it's simply refusing to pay back your perpetrator in his own coin.
So it's very realistic. In no way does it force you to say or even think that it was okay.
None of it was okay. It was, and it's, and I think if you don't have a proper definition of forgiveness, the entire foundation of the process is faulty. And I think you have to start with, what does it mean to you to forgive? And I had someone ask me early in my process, what does it mean to you? And I had no idea. I thought it meant he was off the hook, and that's why I was never going to forgive. I didn't want him off the hook. Well, nobody can be off the hook for killing someone else.
No. 2 is exploring the story, including mine, meaning yours, and Nathan's, that's the name you give to the murderer, as much as possible.
Right. I knew my story. I mean, I had lived my story. My story was, it was everything in my life. That's all I thought about was, what had happened. But it took me 20 years to be curious about who he was. What was his story? And when I started to think about what his story might have been, that's where my story took a turn. And I realized that there's 2 sides to this. It wasn't just my loss. What happened to him? What brought him to this point? Who was he?
And it's a big turnaround you mentioned when in your early 40s.
Yeah, in my 40s, it was actually with a prison minister who I was listening to, who talked about his work with prison ministers, and I was outraged that anybody would even bother to try to help or, save a prisoner. And but he started telling the prisoner's story, at which point it planted this strange seed in my mind, and I thought to myself, who is this guy? Because very strangely, I had never asked his name. In 20 years of, after he killed her, I was spared the trial. I never read a newspaper. I didn't ask a whole lot of questions. I just knew that he had gone to prison. So I never knew his name for 20 years. And that to me is very telling about that second step, because he wasn't human in my mind. I was able to demonize him and vilify him if he didn't have a name. And once I gave him a name and found out his name, it was like Pandora's box. So understanding the other story is important.
Understanding your own and the others, the perpetrator's story.
Right, if possible. Because you don't always get the benefit of doing that. Sometimes you don't know who killed somebody. But if you can, or even imagine what it might have been, it's helpful.
3 is really interesting, and I think maybe the only thing on here that I think is sort of easy, recognizing a shared imperfect humanity. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, I think in these kind of situations, it's easy to think of myself as being right and the perpetrator as being wrong. But one of the things that happens, really, I mean, we're all born into this world sort of pure and clean, and then it's everything afterwards that sort of sets us up for success or failure, or a murderer or a priest or a cop or whatever. But the fact is, we all come in clean and on the same slate. And Desmond Tutu, again, says that, it's like we're all this interwoven fabric, and if you have a tear in one part of the fabric, it compromises the whole. And that's how society is. I mean, when there's an egregious act, and I think we've all seen some of this, and when we have losses and devastations, and whether it's in politics or nature, I mean, it affects all of us. It's not just, it creates sort of a big sentiment everywhere, ripple effect. And so the idea is that we have this shared humanity, and when I recognized that this guy, Nathan, was a human being and had a name, and that he had a story, and that I maybe didn't know early on, and that we shared something that I was never willing to consider, even though our stories are different. We're both human beings that were born. So
it's kind of the extension of number 2, getting the story.
Yes,
your story,
yes, yeah. It's shared humanity, important. Yeah.
Discovering compassion is number 4.
That's pretty easy, because once you start to hear somebody's story, if you're really listening, you might find some compassion. Like if something happened to you along the way that caused you to be a murderer, and I understand what that was, that maybe you were your mother was a drug addict, or your father was dropped you on your head, or was an alcoholic or abusive. I mean, once I start to know those things, there's a little door that opens that says, wow, I still don't think what you did was okay, but I understand a little bit more about what happened, and I actually almost might even feel a little bit bad for you.
I was kind of struck by the word discovering, that it's there. It's not a need to create compassion. You think it's there in us?
Well, I think if you give it an opportunity, if you give someone an opportunity to tell you their story and really listen, you might actually have a seed of compassion for them, for what they went through, separate from you, their own story.
5, offering forgiveness. And that is saying to the other, essentially the definition of forgiveness, and say, I will go that far, but not. That doesn't make you necessarily a good person, or make me.
Well, offering forgiveness is simply saying, I release all my ill will towards you.
Oh, all your ill will.
I mean, I don't say that. I say that if you go back to the definition of forgiveness and what it means, it's easier to offer it if you are basically saying, I'm going to stop hating you and letting you control me in the way that you've controlled me all these years. I'm going to release that hatred towards you. That, to me, was forgiveness.
There's a kind of a popular cliche line that I kind of like for minor offenses. I'm not going to let you rent space in my brain.
I love that.
That's kind of it's true. It's hard to put in practice, but it's absolutely true.
Yeah, it is hard to put in practice. Yeah, because and the weird thing about these steps is that it sounds like it's linear, but it's actually more circular, because you can forgive and then you're going to have to come back and do it all over again, because Martin Luther King says that forgiveness is not a single act, it's a constant attitude. And sometimes you can forgive and then it wells up inside you again, and then you have to go all through it again, and so it looks like it's linear, but I don't really think it probably is. But
6 is reestablishing or releasing the relationship.
Right. Just because you forgive does not mean that you have to stay in a relationship or even renew the relationship. You can just release it. And I was fortunate in my situation because he died after we went through this process. So there was a lot of closure there for me. But I know that in other situations, because I've heard a lot of people's stories over the years, which some of them were just unthinkable. Maybe it's a family member, and how do you stay in a relationship with a family member who's hurt you so terribly? So there's all those challenges, but no one, ultimately the choice is ours to make, whether we want to stay in a relationship or leave a relationship. And forgiving them, one doesn't preclude the other. You can forgive and then release.
I think people have felt this myself, and I've heard other people express it. If you forgive somebody, especially if they're physical neighbors or family, that means you've got to be buddies for the rest of your life. Not true.
I don't think so. I mean, I personally don't think so, but you might have to deal with them, at certain events or peripherally, but ultimately we're the masters of our own, life, and we can choose to be in relationship or the degrees of intimacy, et cetera,
Well, we're getting close to the end. I want to ask you if you could pull a paragraph out of the book that you could read that might reflect the tone or the feeling.
It would probably be toward the beginning, actually.
I have a suggestion.
Oh, good. Okay, good. Okay. Yes, thank you.
I didn't tell you before the show.
Okay, and I'm thinking, wow, I have to think quickly. Yes, this is beautiful. Thank you. I love this passage. My mother's death changed every predetermined notion I had about the world and what it meant to feel safe. It informed everything thereafter, including intimate relationships, motherhood, career, and friendships. Before she died, I'd always thought that murder was something that happened in the news, in faraway places, to other people, and that I was somehow immune to such ugly things. I was mistaken. To this day, I cannot visit New Orleans without feeling the weight of losing my mother. She is in the scent of every flowering magnolia, the moist air that drapes the city, the soulful jazz of the French Quarter, and the rich taste of red beans and rice, and the steady current of the Mississippi River. She is everywhere, yet nowhere, an elusive shadow.
Very nice. Very nicely done.
Thank you.
I want to close with a more kind of a nuts and bolts question. There are people watching for sure who are struggling with forgiveness. Everybody is to one degree or another. How would you advise them to start if they wanted to, if they want to deal with it? Should they see somebody? Should they write? Should they watch the show 10 times?
I think writing is really very healing, and this for me was really my healing process. The writing. I mean, I forgave him, which was one process, and then I wrote the book, which was another process.
How long did the book take altogether?
I actually had to stop writing it for about 5 years because it was so draining emotionally to me that I put it away for 5 years. And it sat in a drawer, and my husband finally said, "Are you going to write the book or not?" But it kept calling me and calling me. And
but the idea of it being good therapy, despite that snag there of 5 years, is good.
It is good, but I think it's hard. And I think that the only way through the room is through the room. You can't get to that door. You can't get out the door without walking through the room. And so I think that we have to go through our process. And some people might choose therapy. Some people, for me personally, I did a little bit of therapy, but I also found that going back into the story, as hard as it was, and it took its toll, enabled me to really discover things that I would have never otherwise discovered. Things about my father and my mother and what happened in their childhood that sort of created so much tension in my family. And
did you write some of the initial drafts or notes longhand?
I've always been, I would write notes of things that popped up in my head in the middle of the night and things, but the draft has always been on the computer.
We are out of time.
Okay.
I'm sorry to say.
No, thank you.
I have a bunch of other questions next time.
Okay.
I want to thank you very much for being on the Writer's Block, Stephanie.
Thank you,
and
John.
sharing Notice of Release with us.
My pleasure.
I want to thank all of you out there in Cape Ann TV land and worldwide on the World Wide Web for being with us on the Writer's Block tonight. If you've learned something about forgiveness from Stephanie Cassatly and the need to forgive and keep forgiving, to recycle that energy, then the Writer's Block has done its job. Thanks again for being with us, and I hope to see you again next week on the Writer's Block.